So without further ado, let's jump into it. Please help me welcome Cameron Josse on stage here, and take it away, man.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Ola, Adam, everybody at 1080 for allowing me to be here today. Really excited about this opportunity. I'm a big fan of 1080 Motion and everything that they stand for, all the equipment that they make. It's a really high quality company, and I'm just very excited to be here. So thanks so much for that. So yeah, today, this presentation will really just I'm going to try to be transparent about what we've been doing with the 1080 Sprint machine and where we hope to go with things. There's going to be some questions that I'm raising that I don't have the answer to yet, but I'm just putting it out there in the universe and seeing what happens. And so, but basically what we're going to focus on is just how we use the Sprint machine to test athletes, monitor athletes, train athletes, and also help athletes return to play. So, from injury. So that's basically the bulk of what we'll talk about today. And so, Aaron Wallman is our head of performance here. He brought me on. I met him when he was at the New York Giants, and I was working at DeFranco's training system. So very excited to be here with him. Does a tremendous job, and I love all the other guys I'm surrounded by as well. Chris Allen, Justin Collette, Peter Remis. Those are the guys on our strength staff, our performance staff. And then Jacob Lauberman is our director of physical therapy here for the football team, who just does a really awesome job coming together with us and helping to bridge the gap and helping our players come back from injury and the whole return to play process. So a lot of the return to play aspects that we'll talk about have a lot to do with Jacob's work, and I have to give him a lot of credit for those aspects of our entire performance system. And just for context, these are just some of the people that have helped to influence my education as it relates to speed. So a lot of the guys at Altus, there's more than are listed here, but obviously Stu McMillan and Dan Paff there, and all these other just coaches and practitioners that are listed here. Dr. J.B. Marin, Dr. Ken Clark are actually going to be my primary supervisors, along with Aaron Wellman, my boss, for my PhD that I will be starting this year. So I'm very excited for that opportunity. So they are largely influential over a lot of the work that I do here. And so I'll present a little bit on what we're doing so far and where we hope to go with all of that. But just some context of the people that have helped educate me in terms of my speed education. So we can start by talking about how we're doing different forms of sprint profiling so that we can individualize our sprint training for each player that's in our program. And so just as a brief review, this might be old news to a lot of people on the call, but I just felt that it was necessary just to review it really quickly. So just some of the metrics that we're looking at with this sprint force velocity profiling, and all of these definitions are credited to J.B. Moran and Pierre Samazino and all the rest of their colleagues that do a lot of this work. So I just took it from their work here. So we have theoretical maximal horizontal force, or F0. And so really what we're looking at is mass specific force here as it relates to acceleration. So, if we take force, it's equal to mass times acceleration. So if we were to basically take force and divide it by mass, we would have acceleration. So this is really just a metric that's referring to the athlete's rate of acceleration. So a higher value would indicate that they have a higher rate of acceleration ability. And so we also have theoretical maximal running velocity, also known as V0, and this is measured in meters per second. And really what it tells us is just the capability of the athlete to continue to produce horizontal force at very high running velocities. So can they continue to accelerate as they're getting faster? Are they good on the back end of a longer sprint? That's what we want to know with all of that. So we also have the maximal mechanical horizontal power, or the P max. And this is really just the theoretical max power output capability of the athlete in the horizontal direction. And all of these metrics in terms of force and power are going to be relative to the athlete's body mass, which really helps us see what their relative strength, what their relative power might be as it relates to sprinting and the sprint acceleration environment. And so we also have these mechanical factors that we're considering in terms of measuring mechanical effectiveness. And so we have the maximal ratio of force, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But basically the maximum ratio of force is what we're basically looking at is what proportion of that athlete's force production is being directed forward or horizontally as they start the sprint. So really upon their first step, how horizontally are they projecting themselves in space? And that's important for us to know for acceleration performance. And then we also have the decrease in that ratio of force. So as that athlete continues to accelerate, what percent drop off are they losing in their ratio of force as they get faster? Because there is this inevitable fact of sprinting that as I continue to get faster and I overcome inertia, as I overcome gravity and I approach top speed, I'm going to get gradually more upright until I am in a fully upright position. And then from there, it's about achieving top speed and maintaining top speed for as long as possible. But what is my decrease in my horizontal ratio of force as I'm getting faster? And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second here as well. And so just as a visual for ratio of force, we have basically two force components. We have a vertical and a horizontal component. And then we have basically the total resultant force between those two components. And so the angle of that force application is going to tell us something about that athlete's ability to project forward. So the more horizontal that is, so the higher the number of their ratio of force, for example, 52%, if it's 55%, 60%, the higher that number, that would indicate more net horizontal propulsive force. So they're able to project themselves horizontally more effectively. So the increase in the maximum ratio of force is really indicative of an increase in mechanical effectiveness as it relates to acceleration. And so, like I said, we also have this decrease in the ratio of force. So if we can see this silhouette here as a sprinter is picking up speed with every step, we can see if we draw these lines here that this athlete is getting gradually more upright. That line is getting a little bit more vertical with every step they take. And rightly so, that's exactly how it should happen. Every step should get a little faster. Every step should get, or the center of mass should rise a little bit with every step they take. And so this is inevitable, right? The body will become more upright and vertical forces, the vertical forces will start to predominate as speeds increase. So really with the decrease in the ratio of force, what we're looking at is if we see a value of say -8%, that would indicate that that athlete is losing 8% of their ratio of force, their maximum ratio of force, with every 1 meter per second increase in speed. So as they increase speed by 1 meter per second, they lose another 8%, right? So let's say they lose 10% and they come out and they're at 55% maximum ratio of force. When they increase their speed 1 meter per second, now they're at 45%, and then at 35%, and so on until they're fully upright. So these are important for us to look at and for us to monitor. And they are, for us, the context of it would be, are we talking about short acceleration or long acceleration, right? Short acceleration, the maximum ratio of force is going to be more important there, how horizontal they are at the sprint start. And if we're talking about a longer acceleration, maybe it's a 40-meter sprint, 40-yard dash, something like that. Now maybe we're looking at the decrease in ratio of force. Do they have the ability to delay that inevitable loss in their horizontal ratio of force so they can accelerate longer and then be able to achieve a higher maximum velocity? So if we have less of a decrease in that ratio of force, then we're going to have a greater mechanical effectiveness. And so, what's the point of us even trying to do these force velocity profiles in the first place? Well, here's an example that is very similar to what JB Moran has presented on before. There's different articles that look at this as well. But let's say we have two athletes that run the exact same 20-meter sprint time. All right, so we have athlete one here, and we have that athlete's metrics there in terms of his V0 and his F0 and his Pmax. And this is actual data from our athletes that we have here. So these are two players that we have in our program and comparing the two of them. Now, if we look at athlete B, right, it's a little bit of a different profile. So athlete A, even though they run the same sprint time, athlete A is going to rely more on his force capabilities, whereas athlete B is going to rely more on his velocity capabilities to achieve that same sprint time. And so if we look at these profiles, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to train these two athletes the same way? And the answer is we probably shouldn't, because athlete A is very force dominant. So if we continue to hammer that athlete's force, then we're just going to basically be beating a dead horse there. So instead of giving that athlete heavy resisted sprinting protocols and all of that, we should probably focus more on the velocity side of things and try to bring that side up. And it's vice versa for athlete B, where that athlete is very velocity dominant. Maybe this athlete would see an increase in acceleration ability if we were able to bring the force side of things a little bit higher. So we just look at where their deficiencies are and we try to figure out how we are going to train these athletes when it comes to times in our program where we're trying to individualize different loads as it relates to sprinting. And so here's the basic assessment that we've done so far. All right, so I call it, this is our preliminary assessment, because right now, and really over the last year since we got here last year, and obviously during the COVID year, everything was kind of delayed, right? So we wanted to put our athletes through a familiarization period. And this whole familiarization period has really gone on to be about a year in length, because we wanted to expose our athletes to sprint testing and sprint training and get them more familiarized with that before we start giving them tests like more of a 30-meter sprint or a 40-yard dash, things that are longer and thus more intense. So what we started with was this 20-meter sprint assessment. And this is not something that's going to be validated in the research. The research does validate a 30-meter sprint assessment done this way, but I just wanted to overview this as what we did to get our athletes familiarized with testing, right? So basically, if you have a 1080 sprint, I just tried to put the different settings that we have here. So I set 2 cones 25 yards apart, and that would ensure that the athlete has full effort the entire acceleration. So 20 meters is equivalent to 22 yards. So if they're sprinting to 25, we know they have full effort the entire time. We set the mode of resistance to isotonic mode, put it at the lowest resistance setting at 1 kilo, which for the athlete, the experience in 1 kilo basically feels unloaded. They certainly feel like just the actual belt that's around their hips, but they don't feel resistance on the machine. It's virtually an unloaded sprint. And then I set it to auto distance recording, which means that the time is going to start recording when that athlete exceeds 0.2 meters per second speed. So anybody that is familiar with velocity-based training in the weight room understands that that is a very slow speed. So essentially, as soon as that athlete twitches forward, as soon as they extend that cable, that time is starting to record. So it's very, very fully automatically timed. And so we wanted to make sure we did that to have the most valid assessment of what kind of sprint times these athletes are achieving. And as further rationale for why we felt comfortable utilizing the 20-meter sprint is, this is a paper from Dr. Ken Clark, who I said will be one of my supervisors going forward. And he wrote this paper specifically talking about the context of American football and the NFL combine. And so where they run a 40-yard dash. And what he found in that paper is that at 20 yards or 18.3 meters, all of these athletes at the combine were greater than 95% of their maximum speed as it related to the maximum speed they hit during the 40-yard dash. And so we felt comfortable that that was going to get them into a position where they were fast enough, but still, for us to be even more valid, we understand we're going to try to utilize a 30-meter sprint test going forward once we feel comfortable with our athlete familiarization, just from the standpoint of trying not to have a bunch of athletes get injured because they're not used to it, that they're not used to that speed loading. Maybe they're not sprinting with technique that we feel comfortable with, and we'll discuss that in a second as well. But this is basically where our head was with all of that. And so how do we get these profiles? Well, here's how we compile the data so that we can do that, is we take the raw velocity data from the 1080 motion, right? There, we can export that into a CSV file. And then from that, we're able to plug this into a spreadsheet that is a free spreadsheet from JB Marin. We plug the raw velocity data into there. We account for things like temperature, barometric pressure, and the athlete's size, height, weight, all of that, right? So we have the athlete's mass plugged into there. And from there, we can get all of these metrics that we need in this profile, as we see right here. And so we basically start to compile this information by taking the raw velocity data from the 1080 sprint. The other thing that we really love about the 1080 sprint is that it gives us very accurate segment times. You know, we can see very accurate 5-meter segments, for example. And so that gives us a lot of information as well. So let's say we have 4 different players here, and these are their 20-meter sprint times, as assessed the way that I described in the previous slide. So from fastest to slowest, in terms of the time that was achieved there. Well, what are some of the things that are helping to explain how these times come about? You know, if we look on the back end here, we don't see much that can help us out with understanding this, right? This player has the fastest time, and yet from 5 to 10 meters is one of the slowest. Same here, one of the slowest from 10 to 15, and certainly is not the fastest one from 15 to 20 meters either. So these segments don't do a great job explaining how he got to here, right? And even if we looked at the back end velocity, this player at the top does not have the fastest velocity on the back end in terms of 10 to 20 meters. This player down here does, right? So when we look at the 0 to 5, there's a huge discrepancy here. And so the accuracy of these segment times is very important for us, because we can see from player 1 to player 4, we're looking at over 0.2 faster in the first 5 meters. So when it comes to short acceleration as a specific context, if we want to increase these players' ability to have a great short acceleration capability, we need to really maximize that sprint start, because this player here shoots out of the cannon so quickly that it doesn't even matter as much that he's unable to continue to pick up the same way that some of these other players might, because he comes out so quickly that when it comes to a distance like 20 meters, which is very relevant for the sport of American football for most positions, this player is going to reign supreme in terms of speed performance. So again, we have to think about context here. This is short acceleration. If we were talking about a longer acceleration, like 30 meters or 40 yards, for example, maybe this wouldn't be as important, and maybe the back end would be more important. So these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, but we're certainly grateful that we're able to achieve compiling this information from the accuracy of the 1080 sprint machine. And so based on our results that we got from these force velocity profiles, and again, because we're utilizing a 20-meter assessment, maybe V0 is underestimated, and perhaps if we use the 30-meter assessment, athletes would be able to achieve a higher velocity, which would then shift the V0 a little bit higher. But these metrics here are what we found so far with our 20-meter assessment. So F0, we want to be greater than 10 newtons per kilogram. These are what our best performers are capable of hitting. We want over 9 meters per second on the V0, over 23 watts per kilo on the P max. We want athletes to achieve greater than 55% in that ratio of force, that maximum ratio of force. And we want to see less than a 10% decrease in terms of the decrease in that ratio of force. So previously I've posted some slides that are similar to these that have metrics on there. And admittedly, at the time, we were utilizing, so JB's Excel spreadsheet, there's two different options. You have one option where you can use segment times to get a force velocity profile. And then you have the other option to use the raw velocity data. So when we first started doing this, I didn't quite have a firm grasp on how to utilize the raw velocity data. I now do. So some of the stuff I've posted previously has been from the segment time data. And the segment time data, what we found, it tends to underestimate the ratio of force. It tends to really overestimate the F0, and it also overestimates the decrease in the ratio of force. So the V0 stays very similar, but things like F0, P max, ratio of force, some of these things are a little bit less valid than if we use the raw velocity data. So we're now utilizing the raw velocity data from the 1080 Sprint CSV file in order to get a little bit more valid measurements there. So this right here is going to be just an overview of how we use the results of these tests to achieve individualized loading when we're doing resisted sprinting, specifically to build horizontal force capabilities in our athletes. This is not something that we do completely year round. We certainly have to take time to focus on just doing unloaded sprint technical work to train faster and just get them used to being unloaded and sprinting. But when we are utilizing our resisted sprinting protocols, these are how we break up our buckets. So we basically have 4 different groups, where group 1 is going to represent the athletes that have a very poor ratio of force. So these athletes have a ratio of force that's less than 50%. So for these athletes, we're going to have a very high focus on horizontal force, really trying to have a strength speed mindset. We want to overload the force side of the spectrum a lot more. So we're going to utilize very heavy resisted sprinting protocol. The type of athletes that fall into this category for us are typically our bigger athletes, our athletes that are about 300 pounds or more. These are athletes that are just very big bodied people, and they struggle to overcome their own body weight in addition to inertia and gravity and all these other forces. So they really struggle to project themselves forward. And so for them, we're going to utilize about a 60% velocity decrement, and we're going to have them travel for 10 yards. And so the 60% velocity decrement is based on their average velocity over that 10-yard segment. So if we were basing it on peak velocity, the number might be a little bit different. But in terms of practicality, it really helps us to utilize the average velocity. And this is why right here. So if we have a player that has an average velocity over their 10 yards of 4.3 meters per second, and we take 60% off of that, now we want that athlete to operate at 1.7 meters per second. So it slows down to a significant amount. So we're really challenging that horizontal force side of the spectrum there. So the time for that athlete to cover 10 yards would be about 5.3 seconds. And if we look at all the athletes that fell into this category, they were all somewhere around 5 seconds, 5.3, 4.9, somewhere in that range. And so what we decided was, let's just load that player until they cross 10 yards in about 5 seconds. And the way that we do that is we put the athletes on sleds, and we basically say go from a coach. and then the coach starts the stopwatch, and it's slow enough where we have this 5-second period where the coach is then saying to the athlete, 1, 2, 3, letting them know where they are in that time point, and they're trying to get there before 5 seconds. So if they are there significantly faster than 5 seconds, we give them more load. And if they're there much slower than 5 seconds, we lighten the load up. So we keep it based on velocity and pacing, basically. And so group 2 would be the athletes that don't have super bad ratio of force, but they still have poor ratio of force. So for them, we're going to try to emphasize keeping them around the load of maximum horizontal power. So a lot of the articles from JB and Samazino and these guys, they're talking about keeping athletes around 50% of their max velocity, or the V0. Well, if we're basing it on average velocity, we found that it's somewhere around this 40% and 50%. So for us, we do a 40% velocity decrement, and they're covering the same amount of distance here. So they're going 10 yards, but the only difference is now they're doing it faster than that previous group. So covering the same distance, but if we see the breakdown here, right, we say 4.7 meters per second is the max average velocity for that segment. We take 40% off of that. Maybe now they're operating at 2.8. And so the time to cover 10 yards, somewhere around 3.3 seconds. So we would load these players until they cross 10 yards in 3 seconds. Same distance, but it's just lighter load, and they're trying to get there faster. And then the last 2 groups are groups that have good ratio of force by our standards and what we're finding, team-wide, basically. So they have effective ratio of force, but are they lacking force or are they lacking velocity now? Like, where is their main issue? So at group 3, these are athletes where we want to continue to improve their maximum power, but we're going to do so by focusing on the force side of the spectrum. So their F0 is more important than their V0 in terms of trying to lift that up, right? These are the velocity dominant athletes that need a little bit more force. So for them, we're going to go a little bit light to moderate resisted sprinting. So maybe we're just keeping them at a 15% velocity decrement, but now they are going for 15 yards. So when we break down the information here, we find that it's going to take them about 15 yards, or it's taking them about 3 seconds to cover 15 yards. So we will load them until they cross 15 yards in around 3 seconds. Again, if they're getting there much faster, we give them more load. If they're getting there too slow, we lighten it up. And then this last group, which is our velocity deficient group, this is our athletes that have good ratio of force, and then they have good F0 as well. They are lacking velocity. So for them, we're going to do a very light, possibly unresisted sprinting protocol. And we also have the option for overspeed. And we have not utilized overspeed yet here. We just didn't feel comfortable based on our athletes' technique. And we wanted to make sure we were putting them in safer positions, which I'll go over in a slide here in a second. But the option is there. If you feel safe to do this with the athletes, then it would make sense, logically speaking. So we're looking at either a 5% velocity decrement or a 5% velocity increase, and they're covering more of 20 yards, so they have the opportunity to achieve higher velocities. So, for example, we could say that we have this athlete here that needs to cover 20 yards in 2.9 seconds. Well, for this entire group, we're going to utilize a 1080 sprint machine to actually train with, because we need to make sure that we are keeping these athletes in very accurate velocity ranges, especially if we're going with overspeed, right? So if we were going overspeed with this athlete here, who has an average velocity over 20 yards of 6.6 meters per second, we would try to bring them up to maybe 6.9 meters per second as a 105% of their max speed, basically. So that's how we look at it, is that final group is the one that actually trains on the 1080 sprint machine, whereas the other groups can get away with utilizing prowlers or plate loaded sleds or things like that, and just having a coach start them and use a stopwatch. And so from practicality purposes, it's certainly not the most valid way to do it. However, it is very practical, and we feel that we are getting the training effect that we want from those groups. And so another important piece of our program is video analysis. So we want to, not just for ourselves to see how our athletes are moving, but we want to be able to show our athletes how they're moving, because if they can see themselves performing sprinting actions as we're explaining what we're looking for, it helps them to piece the two together. Okay, I see what you're talking about. So first things first, let's talk about this kickback fault, because this is something that I'm really big on, and I see it all the time with team sport athletes. And so there's a wonderful article here. This is going to be an article that I'm going to utilize as a framework actually for some of my PhD work. So from Johan Lottie and colleagues here, just looking at some of the multifactorial, just looking at a individualized program for how to help reduce hamstring muscle injury specifically in professional football with this case study. But one of the major parts of this article was looking at these positions at high speed. So we talk about this kickback fault here, where we can see that this athlete has this excessive anterior pelvic tilt where the hips are pointed down towards the ground, and they are kicking excessively out the back here. And what they've been able to show is that they can actually put a score to this by measuring the thigh and hip angle right here. So they give them an actual kickback score, right? So the higher the score, the better, as we'll see in a second. But what we're seeing is this excessive backside swing, which puts a ton of strain on the hamstrings. They're heel striking out in front of their center of mass. And basically, they're just eccentrically loading these hamstrings excessively. And they have poor frontside lift, so they're not getting great power into the ground that would allow them to continue to bounce when they are at high speeds. So in contrast, we see this position is a little bit more optimal here. So we see greater frontside lift. The posture is a little bit more upright, and it's a neutral posture, right? And we can see the kickback score is higher here, where they're not so excessively back behind their body with it. And it's not about if the heel comes close to the butt, it's about where in relation to the midline does that happen. So we see up here, it's far back behind the midline. So they're excessively straining the hamstrings here, whereas here they're allowing themselves to utilize their connective tissues in a more efficient manner. So they're able to utilize their tendons, the muscles around their lower limbs a little bit better than they are here, where the hamstring's taking a big brunt of the load. All right, so there seems to be some evidence to show that these positions are important in terms of keeping athletes healthy. So we can see here with this athlete, let's hope the video plays. There we go. So this is one of our top performers in our 20-meter sprint. And you'll notice coming out, fairly decent positions, right? But now as he approaches the very end of the sprint, we're going to see exactly what we just saw, that kickback fault right there. We start to see it happen there where he starts kicking out the back excessively. So we try to tell our players, listen, you don't have to have great technique to be fast. If you're powerful, if you're quick, all of these things, you can achieve a great sprint time, and you don't have to be in a great position. But we try to let them know that if you're not in a great position, you're putting yourself at risk, right? So we need to work on that to alleviate that, where we want you to be fast and be in a safe position. So we want to reduce what's happening here towards the end with this player of that excessive butt kicking action behind his body there. And so here's another player who ran a very similar sprint time. I think it was maybe 2/100ths of a second slower, but we can see he does not have that technical fault. He attacks front side much better, projects himself across the field a lot better as well. Good arm action, good posture, good front side lift, really bounces across the field. So he's able to achieve a similar sprint time, with much safer looking positions, according to the research on biomechanics. So this is something that we want to show our athletes and explain to them so that they know exactly what we're trying to look for, not just for them, but for everybody. And so let's just talk about some of the ways that we are using these force velocity profiles in our return to play. Right, so we can utilize these profiles to monitor progress during rehab. So let's say we have an athlete that we test right here. These are the metrics that we're looking at, right? So this is one of our fastest athletes on the team. If we notice that if athletes are under 3 seconds in that 20-meter time, that's pretty good in terms of the very fully automated timing. So this is one of our fastest athletes who also sprinted in an unsafe position, which I'll show you in 1 second. So he actually suffered a hamstring injury in practice. Having excessive backside swing probably has something to do with it, amongst other factors as well. But he entered into a rehabilitation program with Jacob, our director of rehab, and Jacob worked on this stuff with this athlete. We came together, we tried to help this athlete understand what we were looking for. We filmed him, we showed him what he looked like. We showed him what more of an efficient pattern looked like. And then during his rehab, we tried to feature some of these contextual sprinting actions as well. And so when we were able to test him again at the end of his hamstring rehab, we just wanted to see how close did we get to when he was healthy, right? So if we look at the sprint time, he was a little bit slower, but we can see how much was he restored, 98% there, right? In terms of V0, we see he's 99% restored there. And this is something that JB and his colleagues talk about, is these athletes will be able to achieve their V0 quicker than they will their F0. However, the F0 was not far off either. So 97% restored, Pmax a little bit less, right? So this allows us to see where this athlete is when he's coming back from injury, and was he where he was when he was healthy, or is he able to possibly exceed that? So if we can measure it, it gives us an opportunity to understand where that athlete is and where the deficiencies might still lie before he's back to being at his optimal capability. So we also utilize video analysis for return to play as well. Like I said, with this athlete in particular, right? So this is basically a video that I showed the athlete of this elite sprinter, one of the athletes at Altus, who has a 100-meter personal best time of 9.94 seconds, so very elite, and just comparing different shapes and getting them to understand what we're looking for. So we can see this excessive anterior pelvic tilt down here, and if we go frame by frame, we see really good frontside lift by this athlete, great posture, whereas our athlete is excessively leaning forward, poor frontside lift, and just not in a great position there. And so this also affects the athlete's vertical displacement at high speeds. So at high speeds, vertical force production is going to be predominant. So we actually want effective vertical forces when we're at high speeds. And we can see this athlete up here has a really great ability to bounce off the ground, large vertical displacement, where ours does not have much vertical displacement. And as a result of that, in this posture right here, we see that this athlete has the thigh excessively behind the midline, where this athlete at the top, this elite sprinter, it's right underneath, right? So in a much better position to prepare himself for the next step. So on touchdown, because this athlete has poor vertical displacement in a poor position, he now strikes leading with the heel first, excessively in front of his body at touchdown, whereas this sprinter up here, who's very elastic, very good vertical force displacement, his knee's almost punching forward upon touchdown there. So this is certainly not something we might expect from our American football players, but it's still the principle of it is to achieve that nice elastic bounce that can then propel me into my next step, where I can continue to bounce and utilize my elastic tissues more effectively instead of just like straining through my muscular system in terms of my hamstrings right there. So, and then we see this athlete again, very elastic, right? So minimal yielding at the hip, knee, and ankle. Again, we wouldn't expect quite this type of a position from our players, but we see how this athlete has poor posture, bent at the hip, bent at the knee, and the ankle is collapsing as well. These thighs are still not together there at full support. So this is the same athlete below as we have above here. So this was after the hamstring injury rehab process and following the intervention and just trying to teach this athlete safer positions when sprinting. And we can see that he was able to pick up on what we were trying to talk about. So much more upright and neutral in his posture here, better front side lift, right? And so a little bit more vertical displacement for him, certainly not at the level of that elite sprinter, but we wouldn't expect that. We can see that now his knee is getting right underneath his center of mass instead of being excessively behind him here. And now the knees are together at touchdown, right? So showing that he had much better vertical displacement, and he's able to get that optimal extension at the hip and get right into that next step to continue to bounce down the field. And so we can see again, he's going to have this yielding at the knee and the ankle because again, these players are not nearly as elastic as elite sprinters, but we can see that he's not excessively leaning forward anymore. He's in a much more neutral and upright posture. So he's in a safer position in terms of the biomechanics associated with high-speed sprinting. So if we compare him again to that sprinter, the shapes look a lot better, right? A little bit closer to what we're seeing up top. And so, again, we're talking about global principles of acceleration, global principles of high-speed running. I don't expect him to look exactly like this. I would never expect him to do that. I just want him to understand these general concepts of what we're looking for to help keep him safe. And so we can talk about a little bit how we utilize the 1080 sprint machine for specialized loading in this return to play process. So this is just some stuff that Jacob and I are starting to mess around with. And again, admittedly, we are just starting to try to understand this. We're certainly not wizards and we're certainly not experts at all of this yet. But here's like a basic idea of what we're looking at so far, right? So we have athletes that have these ACL injuries from last season. So one of the things we want to do is restore their ability to decelerate. And so we can accentuate the deceleration intensity by increasing the eccentric overload, or basically the assistance, right? So we can take a basic drill where the athlete has the cord around his waist and he's facing the machine. So as soon as he was to project this way, he would be assisted in terms of his load going towards the machine. He would be tugged towards it and he would have to decelerate himself effectively, or he would just continue to run towards the machine. So we could set these cones here 1 to 1.5 yards apart. And basically this athlete would start on 2 feet and then jump through the air forwards and try to land on one limb and completely decelerate. So what we've done is we've set the assisted speed to 5 meters per second because we found some of our better athletes are, they're greater than 2.5 meters per second when they're taking off through the air, which we'll talk about in a second. So, but none of them are reaching that 5 meters per second in terms of the velocity of the jump going forward. So that's just an upper limit that allows them to really just take off and not be limited by the speed, the assisted speed. And then we start them at 3 kilos of pull, and then we start to go up from there, right? We're going to start them more at 1 yard apart instead of 1.5 yards apart. So we face the machine, jump off 2 feet, land on one, and they have to stick and hold that deceleration for 2 seconds for it to count as a rep. If they land and they start rolling forward too much, or they take a couple steps out, we tell them, hey, go back, redo that rep. Let's get that nice firm deceleration for 2 seconds, right? So if we wanted to continue to increase the intensity of the deceleration, we can do one of two things, or we can do both. We could increase the assisted load. So instead of 3 kilos, maybe I'm pulling that athlete towards the machine with 9 kilos of pull now. So it's a little bit more intense in terms of the tug towards the machine, which would increase the deceleration intensity. Or we could set these cones further apart so that the approach speed in terms of the jump and then landing by this cone becomes more intense. Or we can do both together, right? And so what we're really focusing on is how comfortable is that athlete in terms of allowing himself to be pulled through the air and then immediately decelerate that. Is he comfortable with that, or is he not, right? So we can look at a couple different examples here. So this is one of our players coming back from ACL injury, 4 months post-surgery. He had a patellar tendon graft. And something that's interesting about that, as we can see in the video here, that he's afraid to use his knee, right? This is his repaired leg, his left leg here. He's afraid to bend at the knees. He wants to utilize his hip more, and it was his patellar tendon graft that they took. So he's trying to rely more on his hip there. But we can see this is a 1 yard entry here. So let's just look at like the eccentric speed, or the assisted speed, I should say, into that deceleration. So on his healthy leg, we're looking at maybe 1.88 meters per second, and then his injured leg, his ACL injured leg, his left leg, 1.8. So there's a 4.3% asymmetry there. So maybe we don't think that that's that much. Over time, we're going to learn what is significant and what's not. But if we bring that load up to 6 kilos, we see now it's slower. And the reason why it's slower is because that athlete is afraid, maybe subconsciously, of just letting himself being pulled towards that machine. Even in this video, we can see he's basically got this little arc in his jump, right? He's not allowing himself to just rip and stick, going straight forward horizontally. He's trying to hesitate into that deceleration. So if we look at his left leg now, if we went on 6 kilos, this heavier assisted load, much less than before, right? So we see a 12.4% asymmetry there. So that's likely significant. Again, we need to continue to monitor this to determine what is significant and what is not, right? But our high performing healthy players, like I said before, doing a drill like this, they're going to achieve an assisted speed of greater than 2.5 meters per second. So basically, they're able to achieve that higher speed because they feel more comfortable just jumping into the assistance and then immediately stopping it because they're healthy, right? This athlete doesn't feel like he's fully healthy yet. He's still in rehab. It makes a lot of sense. So again, even on his healthy leg, he's not feeling super confident compared to a high performing healthy player. So these are things that we need to monitor over time to improve his confidence when it comes to decelerating on a single limb. So here's another example of a player. And this athlete had a hamstring tendon graft. So this is actually his 3rd ACL tear in his career. He's one of our freshmen who came into college already having 2 ACL tears, and then he got a 3rd one last season. So you can notice a difference here where he's much more comfortable going through his knee, right? He's trying to avoid using his hip because they took the hamstring tendon. So that's where the damage was done in terms of the damage incurred from the actual surgery itself. So much more knee bend than that athlete, a different strategy to decelerate. So the video is important here as well, not just the numbers that we're achieving. But this athlete was very comfortable in terms of symmetry between the limbs, as we'll see. So he utilized even more loading than that last athlete. So we got him first at maybe 9 kilos. And we can see here a 2.9% asymmetry there. So again, not close to what these high performing healthy players are doing, but there's not a lot of asymmetry here from injured limb to non-injured limb. So we brought him up to 12, and again, there wasn't much of an asymmetry there either. So our strategy with this player was really, okay, let's increase the approach speed now. So going forward, instead of having these cones 1 yard apart, let's go 1.5 yards apart. And now that'll allow him to have an increased approach speed into it and have to decelerate more intensely. And hopefully we can get that assisted speed to go higher, because we need him to experience something around this, or, you know, even over 3 meters per second. So because he's not doing that yet, we need to get him into that setting and allow him to get into that experience. So these are just some of the like little basic drills in terms of single limb deceleration that we're looking at. But we can then progress them into a more global deceleration type of drill or activity or exercise, whatever you want to say. So if we want to monitor more global deceleration capacity, we can utilize a drill like from this document from 1080 Sprint, where they just talk about a basic 505, right? So we're looking at basically accelerating 5 meters towards the machine with the assisted loading, or 5 yards if you want to do it that way. Decelerating, coming to a complete stop, and then redirecting back, but doing that quickly, right? Or what we could do is we could even just isolate that deceleration phase by sprinting full speed here, coming to a stop, and then just walking backwards, right? So we can really isolate that 1A phase right there. So for us, what we are interested in monitoring with this technology is going to be the duration of that deceleration phase, or that phase 1A is probably more accurate to say. We want to monitor the assisted load that's being used. How much pull are we giving that athlete towards the machine? And what's the speed in that phase? So we'll get into that a little more detail on this next slide here, where, you know, we can see on this graph, right, again, from you guys, from 1080 Motion, this document here, we have this phase 1A where we're accelerating, then we're decelerating, and then we're redirecting and re-accelerating out of that. So if we just think about phase 1A, right, this deceleration phase, maybe with these athletes that are coming back from ACL injury, the metrics that we are most concerned with looking at are going to be that phase time, the assisted speed during that phase, and how much pull were we giving that athlete, how much tug towards the machine. Because we know that if we increase this, the intensity will go up, right? If this can get higher, that's our goal. We want them to be able to decelerate from a higher assisted speed, because the more assisted speed they can handle and decelerate from that and come to a complete stop, the better their deceleration capacity. So we're concerned with that, and the phase time goes in line with that as well, right? And so again, we can increase this by increasing the approach speed as well if we wanted to continue to increase the intensity. So maybe it's not just 5 meters and decelerating. We have them go 10 meters and decelerate, or 15 meters and decelerate. So they're trying to decelerate from higher and higher speeds, and that's our goal. And again, we don't know yet exactly what our goals are with that, and admittedly, we're just trying to figure that out. So these are just some of the areas that we're currently thinking about when it comes to return to play, and possibly just monitoring even with our healthy athletes, just seeing what their deceleration or change of direction capacities might be. So these are just where our minds are right now with a lot of this stuff. And so that's really all I have for you guys. And I wanted to keep some time for some Q&A if anybody had any questions, but thank you guys so much. And this is my Twitter account. It's the only form of social media that I have. So that is at IU Coach Josse. IU standing for Indiana University, and you can follow me there and communicate with me there. And I just really thank everybody in attendance. And again, I thank you, 1080 Motion, for allowing me to come in and talk today. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Cameron. That was great. And based on the questions and traffic in the Q&A and also in the comments/chat section, this was obviously of interest, that's for sure. So I think we have time for a couple of questions, but I think some of these questions are better suited for a longer discussion, Cameron.
Okay.
So we will set up a where we tape that retrospectively. But there were a couple of questions here that we can try to answer today, and I'll start with one, and I think it's a fundamental, almost philosophical question in a sense. Would you train the athletes towards their strength? You know, when we think of the force-velocity relationship, we're targeting the quote-unquote weakness. So if they're force dominant, do you want to target that force dominance versus going after velocity and vice versa. Do you have any thoughts and ideas and suggestions? This becomes a little bit wider, almost philosophical in a sense.
No, absolutely. It's a great question. And
I think so too.
you know, I would argue that the way we approach it here is that we spend the majority of the year trying to have a very well-rounded holistic program. So what I showed with the individualized resisted loading, that's typically for short phases. So we might do that for maybe 4 weeks and then get away from that and do more of a global holistic training program in general. The whole time we're trying to focus on that sense of being global and holistic. But yeah, we certainly want to maximize our athletes' strengths. We want to train them towards that as well. If we have a fast person, we want them to continue to be fast, right? We don't want to take that away from them. So that's where people can, in my opinion, get carried away with some of the force velocity profiling stuff, is maybe it shows up as this athlete needs force. Okay, so now everything we're going to do is training for force. I think that's probably overkill, and it will probably negatively affect what they're good at. So we need to make sure that we keep some sense of their strengths present. You know, so even if we're taking a very fast athlete who's focusing on force to help bring that up as a limitation for that athlete, we still need to ensure that they're doing unresisted sprinting, like unloaded sprinting work, plyometrics, other things that are very fast in nature, very elastic, quick, all those different adjectives, right? And we're just utilizing some of that loaded sprint work. I just see it as special strength for sprinting. To me, it's no different than utilizing certain activities in the weight room to pick or to develop certain outputs for a certain reason. And that's what we look at, but we don't base our entire speed training program just on force velocity profiling and these individualized loads. We still have to develop a progressive sprint training program in general that just follows a natural progression, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. No, but I think that's an important point to get across. So we don't, stare ourselves blind on this relationship and we follow everything here, but we put that into a comprehensive model. And some of the other questions that we'll talk about at a later time actually speaks to that as well. There was one really good question that I think will be helpful for the audience, and that was on the hamstrings case. When you did that return to play testing, and obviously being a physio myself, how long was the hamstring rehab? Did you test one or multiple times, and how close to the competition did you test? So we put it in get a sense of the severity of the injury and what have you.
Yeah, so that player he experienced that injury during training camp. He's a wide receiver, which is a position that relies heavily on speed. And he was a guy that we had noticed technically had some issues, but when you're in this team sports setting, it's difficult to get to everybody on such a short timeline. And so we did our best especially with COVID, where we were very limited as well. So he got that injury during training camp, and the timeline was really a matter of weeks, because it wasn't a terrible hamstring injury. It was more of a hamstring tweak. So he was out for a couple weeks doing rehabbing. I want to say 2 to 3 weeks. And that post test was like the last bit of his rehab. It wasn't in the middle of his rehab. So he was doing basic hamstring rehab with Jacob. Jacob would have the specifics on exactly what all that was. But when Jacob came to me and he felt comfortable to have him sprint full speed again, we reassessed that. And then we also, we filmed him sprinting before the force velocity test, just to show him what he looked like. So we did the video first, and then we did the sprint test as well towards the end of that phase. But it was a matter of a few weeks, so it wasn't a devastating hamstring injury. But we just but it was close to competition because it was during training camp, so we were getting very close to our first game. He was able to play in that first game, but that's basically the timeline of it.
Perfect. One more question, and then I think we'll wrap it up. And I've heard this question from others as well. How do you set up the sprint on the ground versus elevated? Personally, I've used both. Any thoughts on that one? Because I saw images or films where you had it up on a little trolley or what have you. in the back there.
Yeah, when we got here, we found the machine on top of that wagon, and
Okay, so you need it.
yeah, so when Dr. Matt Ray was here, I guess he had used it on that wagon and just kind of wheeled it around to get it to different areas. And so I found it that way, and I said I kind of like that, you know, just keeping it in line with really where the hip is. And so all of our use here with it has been on top of that little wagon, and I've used it both ways in the past, but we seem to like it the way it is, just being up on that little bit of a lift there.
Yeah, because it's I've done that myself, and then it seems like, you know, the further you get away from it, the less of an influence that, you know, inferior angulation has. So it could have some sort of effect early on if you're close to the sprint when you start out. That would be my thinking around it.
Hey,
Anyway.
Ola, real quick, and Cameron,
Yes.
are you usually using the hip harness, or are you also using a shoulder harness? They also were asking that question.
We utilize only the hip harness. You know, maybe if we were to go in gear 2, we might have a reason to use, but we don't like the shoulder harness as much, just because of the way it limits the mobility of the upper body. So a big thing, we want to make sure that we free them up there, and we don't use gear 2 too much when we're utilizing the machine, because we're using the machine really with our velocity deficient guys mostly. So you know, I could understand why somebody might use that in gear 2 to get a better lean or something like that. But yeah, we utilize the waist harness exclusively just for what we're doing with it.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Cameron, for doing this, and thank you for all people all over the globe watching.